you should have part 5 in front of you. So if you do not, then you didn't grab one from the back. So come grab one from the back. So the first 4 parts that we've done so far are things that you run into more often, like the area and the perimeter of squares and rectangles, and the circumference, the radius, diameter, area of a circle. All of those things you did a lot of already in junior high or geometry and whatever. So it was just a refresher. But the volume of cylinders, you don't see very much after 8th grade. They said last class in 7th period said that they did talk about it a little bit in geometry, but not much. Okay, so this is the formula that you're going to be using today. The volume equals pi r squared h. So we talked last week about whenever you see pi in a formula for our class, what are we going to use in our calculator instead of pi? 3.14. That way we get all the same numbers that we're rounding and everything. So we're going to use 3.14 when we're talking about pi. Let's see, my thing got moved, so there's a glare on it again. Oops. Anyway, okay. So, what about radius? How do we figure out the radius if we're given the diameter? What does the radius equal? How do we calculate that if we're given the diameter? Remember, the diameter is all the way across, and the radius is only part of the way. How much of the way is the radius?
Halfway.
Halfway. So we can take the diameter and divide it by 2 and get our radius. Okay. So in this very first problem down here, so the radius is going to be from here to here. Okay, so half of that, whereas the diameter is all of it. So down here, we have find the volume in cubic inches. So that tells us what units we're going to be using. Of a can of household cleaner to the nearest hundredth. How many decimal places is the nearest hundredth?
2.
2. How did you know that, Max? Do you have it memorized? Or do you have a trick that you use to remember it?
2 numbers back.
2 numbers back. Yep. So how many zeros are in 100? 2. Okay, so if there's a number with a th on the end, figure out how many zeros is in that number, and that is how many decimal places you're going to go after the decimal. So 100 has 2 zeros in it, so it means it's to 2 decimal places. Okay, if it said tenth, then how many zeros is in the 10? 1. So how many decimal places are we talking about? 1 decimal place, right? And if it says 1,000, how many zeros are in 1,000? 3. So you would go 3 decimal places. So now we also need to convert everything in fractions to decimals. So we know that we're going to round to the nearest hundredth. And then we need to change 3.5 inches into a decimal. So how do we change 3.5 inches into a decimal? 3.5. So This equals 3.5, but it's the diameter. And remember, my formula up here calls for the radius, right? So the radius. So how am I going to find the radius if I'm only given the diameter? We're going to take that number and divide it by 2. Okay. So then we have and 8 inches in height. So this is my radius right here. My formula is pi r squared times height. So we're multiplying all of this. So I'm going to use 3.14 times this, because this is my radius. You don't need to simplify this if you're using our calculators. If you're not, then go ahead and simplify it. Okay? But you have to put it in parentheses to square it if you're going to leave it as a fraction. Because if you don't, the calculator will only square the top part or the bottom part. Okay, so if you want it to be all of it, then you need to make sure to put it in parentheses and square that whole fraction that we have as our r. Okay? And then times h, which is 8. Okay, so we've got 3.14 times, right, this time squared times 8. So we can put that in our calculator. So here's my calculator. Okay, and I'm going to type it in. 3.14 parentheses. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see. 3.14 parentheses. Okay, I want it to be a fraction, so I did control divide to get my fraction. So 3.5 divided by 2. Okay, this button right here is your squared. Most of y'all have been using these calculators, I know, but just in case you haven't. Okay, so squared, and then times 8. Hit enter. Well, it gives it to us in to the nearest hundredth. It gives it only 2 decimal places. So what's my answer in this blank going to be? Can you read that? 76.93. That is my cubic inches. So now it says 1 pint equals this many cubic inches. So my next question says, then find the volume in pints. Okay, then find the volume in pints. So we're going to use this equation that they give us. We're going to take the answer that we just got, cubic inches, and divide it by 28.9. So in my calculator, I'm just going to take that answer and I'm going to divide it by 28.9. So I get 2.66. I only need 2 decimal places. That 1 is going to make the 6 stay the same. I don't care about the other numbers after that. That's it. How do you change a decimal or a fraction to a decimal if you don't know what it is on your calculator? So on this calculator, if I did 3 and then I did 1/2, oops, oh, goodness gracious. If If I didn't put the space for one, I mean, if I didn't put something in there, if I put a space in there, it's going to multiply it. It's not going to, um, hey, that's actually, you know what, I didn't know it converted like that. Anyway, because that worked fine, because most of the time, when my pre-algebra students do 3, and then they do the 1/2, they don't get it to tell them the right thing. But if you need it as a decimal anyway. So I always tell them to do the 3 plus the 1/2. Because if you don't, then it might multiply it instead of adding it like you need. So, well, a while ago, we got 3/2, which was not correct anyway. So that's what actually happened. It multiplied it instead of added it. We should have got 7/2. If you want a decimal when you do this, okay, all you have to do is put a decimal behind one of your numbers. Any of your numbers, it does not matter, and it will give it to you as a decimal. So you should know some of your decimals. Some of them are not as simple or common to know. And so I'm providing you with a cheat sheet for your decimals. So this is just, if you're given a fraction, this tells you what decimal you can use in your calculator to be equivalent. You do not have to use that chart. It is just there for you if you would like it. Okay.